But if they don't go along, they won't get the transportation dollars from the federal and state government. The MPOs pass out federal dollars, they pass out the state dollars, so they have some power over the cities. MPOs are made up of representatives of each of the major cities in the region. So theoretically, it's democratic, but in fact, it can become very autocratic. Now, I went to planning school. Some of you probably know enough about planning to know that there is, in theory, a rational planning process. That's where you develop goals, you identify some alternatives that can meet those, that might be able to meet those goals, evaluate the alternatives to see how well they meet the goals, and then pick a preferred alternative, maybe develop a new alternative that comes closest to meeting those goals. This is called the rational planning process. It's taught in planning school. Every planner knows it, and yet almost no plans follow it, especially these long-range regional transportation plans. A few years ago, I reviewed the long-range regional transportation plans for the 72 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And only a couple of them came close to what I would consider a rational planning process. So you look through these plans and you'll find out in some cases they're very influenced by smart growth and livability, and in other cases they're not. In other cases they just want to build roads, they just want to provide good mobility for people. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what are the goals. Are they talking about reducing VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, or are they talking about relieving congestion? Oftentimes reducing VMT has become a goal, even though all it really does is it makes people poor. The state of Washington, for example, has passed a law mandating a 50% reduction in per capita VMT, per capita driving by 2050. That's going to make people poor. Are they talking about increasing transit ridership, or are they talking about reducing energy consumption and pollution? If their goal is increasing transit ridership, they're looking at really more inputs than outputs. Transit uses as much energy and pollutes as much as driving. But there's this myth that if we get people out of cars and on a transit, we're going to save energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution. Are they talking about affordable housing or housing affordability? Affordable housing means we're going to take your tax dollars and subsidize low-income housing for a handful of people. Housing affordability means that the general level of housing is affordable to everyone in the area. In other words, the rich people can afford better housing, the moderate income people can afford median priced housing, and low income people can afford low income housing. But when you start talking about affordable housing, that probably means that they made housing unaffordable for everybody, but they're going to assuage their consciences by building a few units at somebody else's cost, of course, of low-income housing, and then selling it or leasing it or renting it to those low-income people at a lot lower price. So looking at their goals gives you a clue about whether they're trying to effectively manage a region, to be an efficient, have an efficient transportation system, or whether they're trying to socially engineer people to behave a certain way, drive less, live in high-density housing, or so on. Now the next question is, does your plan have a full range of alternatives? Most plans don't have any alternatives at all. Some of them have one or two alternatives, and very few of them have what I would consider to be a full range of alternatives. Now, if I were a planner, and I'm not, I'm an anti-planner, but if I were a planner, this is how I would do it, okay? I would determine what my criteria are, my goals are. My goals might be to reduce congestion, or to save energy, or to eliminate air pollution. And then, you know, those are all different goals, so I'd identify a whole range of goals, and then I'd look at all the possible projects I can do in my region. Bike paths, freeways, hot lanes, rail transit, bus transit, all kinds of projects, and then I'd compare how much each of those projects will accomplish each of those goals, and then rank them according to each goal. So I'd have a ranking according to which projects are most reduce the congestion the most, which projects reduce energy, save energy the most, which projects reduce pollution the most, and then I would have an alternative for each goal. I'd have an alternative that consisted of all the projects that did the most to reduce congestion, And then another alternative that had all the projects that did the most to save energy. And another one that all the projects that did the most to reduce air pollution. And then I would see develop a preferred alternative that is kind of a compromise that comes the closest to satisfying all those criteria. Now, as it happens, I think that in most cases, if it reduces congestion, it saves energy and it reduces pollution too. So probably these goals are compatible, but I'm sure they can think up some goal that's going to be incompatible, so you'll have some different alternatives. That's how I would develop alternatives. Nobody does it this way. They should, but they don't. Now, when you look at these goals and these alternatives, you need to think about how you rank them. I said, does the most to reduce pollution? Well, of course, if you spend $1 billion on a massive freeway, that's going to do, I don't mean pollution, congestion. Spend $1 billion on a massive freeway, that's going to do a lot to reduce congestion, as opposed to just widening one block of one street by one lane. That's going to not do as much. But you really have to think about what's the cost and what's the benefit. Now, you're probably used to thinking of benefit-cost ratios. You calculate the dollar benefits, you calculate the dollar costs. If the benefits are greater than the cost, then the ratio might be 10 if the benefits are 10 times cost, or 2 if they're twice cost, or whatever. So normally, to develop an alternative, you would select the projects that have the highest benefit-cost ratio until you run out of money, but making sure you never do a project that has a benefit-cost ratio of less than 1. That's if you can figure out what the dollar value is of all benefits. Well, what's the dollar value of reduced congestion? What's the dollar value of saving of energy? What's the dollar value of a reduced ton of greenhouse gas emissions? You know, people can come up with some numbers, but they're hard to do. So we have another criterion called cost efficiency or cost effectiveness. The terms mean the same thing, in which you say, how much does it cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 ton? How much does it cost to save 1 hour of travel time? By reducing congestion, and you save 1 hour of travel time. How much does it cost to save 1 million BTUs of energy? So you figure out the cost per unit, whatever your units are, and that way you can rank your alternatives. And the difference is, with benefit-cost ratios, since you're using dollars on both benefits and costs, if the benefits are greater than the cost, you know it's worthwhile. For cost effectiveness, you have to have a lot of alternatives. Benefit-cost ratio, you don't. You only need to look at if benefit-cost ratio is greater than 1. If it's less than 1, don't do it. If it's greater than 1, do it. You can afford it. But for cost effectiveness, you have to look at a lot of alternatives. If you only look at 3 alternatives and there's 10 more out there that might be cheaper, you're not really finding the most cost-effective way of reducing congestion or reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whatever. So, just as an example, the Federal Transit Administration has had several cost-effectiveness formulae, ways of figuring out whether it's cost-effective to build a rail or bus system. The first one is called the cost per new rider. That's where you take the capital cost that's annualized. In other words, you use a mortgage. The capital cost might be $1 million, so you use a mortgage calculation formula to say, well, what's the annual cost of that? You use some interest rate over 30 years or something like that, plus the annual operating cost, and you divide by the annual new riders. In other words, you're carrying so many people today, you put in this new transit investment, you're going to carry some new riders, you hope. So you project how many new riders you're going to carry per year. Pinellas Light Rail, $134 million is the annualized capital cost, $29 million is the annual operating cost. They project 1.7 million new riders, so the cost of getting one person out of their car for one trip is $96. If you take somebody who's commuting to work by car today, 250 days of the year, and you get them out of their car and onto the light rail instead, that's $96 per trip times 500, because it's 250 round trips, $48,000 per year. It would be cheaper to give them a new 5 Series class BMW every single year for the next 30 years than to build this light rail. But if you think BMWs are environmentally unsound, well, maybe they'd be willing to accept a brand new Tesla Model S every other year for the next 30 years rather than having a new car every year. The point is, this is extraordinarily expensive, and they should have looked at it. They did look at it and compared it with buses, and buses were a lot more cost effective, and yet they chose the rail anyway. The Federal Transit Administration then came up with another cost effectiveness formula. They said the first formula was developed during the Clinton administration, and the Bush administration said just getting people out of their cars and onto transit isn't really our goal. Our goal is to save people time. We're supposed to be relieving congestion. So they said, what's the cost per hour of congestion relief? And with Pinellas Light Rail, it's about $87 an hour. With the bus rapid transit, it was only about $40 an hour. The Bush administration also said, we're not going to fund any projects that cost more than $25 an hour. Okay? Well, the Obama administration came in, and by the way, if this is your only project, you say it's cost effective because there's no other alternatives. You have to have a wide range of alternatives to see what might only cost $5 an hour or $10 an hour instead of just looking at the $86 an hour project. The Obama administration came up with a new cost effectiveness formula. You calculate the cost per rider, and it's cost effective. No alternatives, no new riders, no time saved. They don't care about any of that stuff. All they care about is the cost per rider. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, when Pinellas, whoops, what happened here?
You hit the wrong button.
Oh, I went back too fast. Here we go. When Pinellas Light Rail calculated that it would save 1.4 million hours, that was the savings for bus riders who were then riding a light rail. It didn't consider the cost to auto travelers who were stuck at crossing gates at the 41 street crossings for light rail. It specifically said in the regulations that they had to consider that, but they never did. So that's one of the things you have to watch out for. But anyway, this is not cost effectiveness. This is what the law, the regulations now says is cost effectiveness, but in fact it's not, because they don't require you to look at a wide range of alternatives. Now the next thing you need to look at to get an idea of whether this is a socially engineering plan or a mobility plan that really is aiming at increasing mobility is, what is the balance in funding? The transit advocates like to say they want balanced transportation funding. So this is Austin. 99% of all motorized travel is by automobile, 1% is by transit. Their idea of balanced transportation funding is that 2/3 of all the dollars should go for transit, 26% for automobile, and 8% for bikes and pedestrians. That's balanced for them. This is just to show you cost effectiveness. Austin opened a commuter rail line about in 2010, and about the same time they opened a commuter bus line. The commuter rail line cost $130 million. The commuter bus line cost less than $2 million. The commuter bus line also costs less to operate, and it carries more riders. Nevertheless, they want to build more rail. There's also a feeling that rail and high-density development go together. We've talked about that a lot. A bunch of weirdos in the front there.
They must have a boost yesterday.
They must be new urbanists, fans of new urbanism.
Oh, rail fans.
Yeah. So the planners like to say that there's a connection between transportation and land use, and so they build this into their plans, the assumption that they can influence land use by influencing transportation, and that they can influence transportation by influencing land use. Well, the truth is, it's a one-way street. If you have a new kind of transportation that's cheaper, faster, and or more convenient than the old transportation, that will have an influence on land use. Streetcars had an influence on land use when the only alternative was walking. Cars had an influence on land use when streetcars was the only alternative. But going back to streetcars, to a slower, more expensive, less convenient system isn't going to influence land use. So they're wrong about that. Land use doesn't work, and it doesn't work the other way. You can't go into higher densities and change the way people move. And that's one of their fundamental assumptions. It simply doesn't work. We can look at these numbers. These numbers compare the density of urbanized areas in 2010 with the percentage of people who drive to work. And you can see there is a small change. Like here's the lowest density urbanized area, about 97% of people drive to work. Here's the highest density urbanized area, 7 times denser, and it's about 98 or 88% of people drive to work. So 7 times denser for about a 10% reduction in commuting by car. That's not a big change. Now there are some down here that are lower, but those are mostly college towns and New York City, which has a really dense job core, and it's a dense job core that makes New York City more effective. An economist at the University of California named David Brownstone was asked by the Transportation Research Board to do a literature survey of the link between transportation and land use. And he said, well, there is a link. It's too small to be useful to try to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's just not going to be useful. Transit's problem is that it really is there to serve people who don't have cars. And there's very few people who don't have cars anymore, at least among the working population. This is Pinellas County. 3.9% of workers in Pinellas County, Florida, don't have cars. And I can show you this for any other county or urban area or whatever. It's about the same. It's about 2 or 3%. But how do the people who don't have cars get to work? It turns out in Pinellas County, 37% of them drive alone to work. How do they do that? Well, maybe their employer supplies the cars, maybe they have zip cars, car sharing, I don't know. Another 11% carpool, only 13.5% take transit to work. So transit isn't even relevant to most people who don't have cars, much less people who do have cars. So transit has made it its mission to no longer serve people who don't have cars. Instead, they're going after the choice riders, trying to make fancy transit systems that will get people out of their car because it's so cool to ride light rail or whatever. Another interesting number is that you're more likely to take transit to work if you earn $75,000 or more than any other income class, including people who earn less than $25,000. So what we're really doing is we're subsidizing the rich. And why is that? It's because the downtown jobs are good jobs. They're finance, real estate, insurance jobs. They get paid a lot, and that's where transit works, is taking people downtown. Now, getting back to your transportation plan, what kinds of projects are considered? Remember I said we needed to come up with a list of projects, rank them somehow, and develop your alternatives based on those rankings. Well, one kind of project is traffic signal coordination. It's the most cost-effective thing. I guarantee it's the most cost-effective thing in your community and everywhere else. The only city in America that has coordinated all of its traffic signals is Indianapolis. If you haven't, Los Angeles coordinated all of its signals?
Yes.
Okay.
City of Los Angeles.
Okay, well, good. But a lot of cities aren't.
Bellevue's got 172, and they're all working.
Okay. Well, I guess I shouldn't say the only city, but few cities in America have coordinated all their signals. So coordinating signals will do a lot to relieve congestion. A lot of cities are too busy doing things that are big and grandiose, building urban monuments, rather than actually providing good transportation. Hot lanes are pretty cost effective. They're not as cost effective as traffic signal coordination probably, but they're still pretty cost effective. Traffic calming is very cost effective if your goal is to annoy motorists. But if your goal is to relieve congestion, traffic calming is not a good tool at all. Rail transit is a terrible way of trying to relieve congestion. I like to say that they're laughing at the taxpayer for the fact that they funded these rail transit lines. So, if you go through your regional transportation plan, deep in the plan, you should find tables showing what the effects of the plan are. Now, a few of them don't show anything. They don't reveal anything. They just come up with a list of projects and that's it. Most of them, though, do estimate what the effects of the plan are on congestion, pollution, all the things you want. Very few of them go into housing affordability, except in California, where a law has been passed called SB 375 that mandates that cities do land use and transportation planning together to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make housing more affordable. So for example, well, let's look at Portland. Here's what the numbers that are in their plan. Today, 92% of all travel is by automobile, and by 2040, and only about 3% is by transit. By 2040, they expect to double transit and increase walking and bicycling a little bit, but that means automobile will decline from 92% to 88%. It sounds like progress, but they're expecting 75% more people in the region, so they're really getting a 67% increase in auto travel with no new roads. They're expecting miles driven per person will double, and time wasted in congestion will quadruple. Those numbers are all straight out of their plans. You can find that in the Regional Transportation Plan published by Portland's MPO. So you should be able to find those numbers in your plan as well. California, I mentioned SB 375 is a law that requires a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and affordable housing. Here's what happened in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the current level of greenhouse gas emissions. The state has passed a bunch of rules to require more fuel-efficient cars, and that's going to reduce it by 30%. And then the region has adopted what's called the Climate Initiative, which is supposed to reduce it by another 2%. And then Plan Bay Area, which consists of packing 80% of all new housing in 5% of the region's land area, will reduce it by another 1%. So they get a 1% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And meanwhile, for housing affordability, they say right now the percent of household income spent by lower and middle income households on housing right now is 67%. Their goal is to reduce that to 57%. Sounds good. What did the plan do? It increased it to 69%. And they just shrug their shoulders and say, oh well, too bad. Very few plans are going to talk about housing affordability. But if they are trying to be social engineers, if they're trying to pack people into higher density housing, that means at the same time they're going to try to limit single family housing. Otherwise, nobody's going to want to live in that high density housing. And you'll have to look and see what's going to happen to housing affordability. We can look at cities that have done this. This is what I call a Caldwell Banker house, a 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 2,400 square foot house. Every year, Caldwell Banker comes out with estimates of the value of this size of a house in cities all across the country. I've posted those estimates online for the last 8 or 9 years because they only keep the most recent year online. And in Houston, that house right now is about $180,000. You can see in these cities that don't do smart growth, they're very inexpensive. Portland, it's twice as much. Boston is 3 times as much. Seattle and San Jose, it's about 4 times as much. And at the peak of the housing bubble, it was even worse in cities that did this kind of planning. This is housing median home price divided by median family income. This is the standard measure of affordable housing. If the median home price is twice median family income, you can buy a house and get a mortgage and pay it off in less than 15 years. If it gets up to 4 times median family income, it's going to take you probably more than 30 years, depending on interest rate. Today's interest rate is about 30 years. And then when it's much more than 4 times, it's going to be impossible for you to pay it off at a regular mortgage. And so you end up with stuff like this. You can buy a 1,100 square foot condo in San Jose for $400,000. That's considered affordable housing. These plans not only make housing unaffordable, they make housing prices more volatile, which makes it more risky to buy a house. You've seen these pictures before, graphs like this before. This is the housing bubble we just went through. Housing prices shot up, they peaked, and then they collapsed. But they did that in cities that had this kind of smart growth planning. If you didn't have that kind of planning, this is what the housing bubble looked like. They went up slightly, and then they went down a little bit after the financial collapse. Notice on this one, it peaked in 2006. The financial collapse was 2008. It was a decline that caused the collapse, whereas on this one, the decline happened after the collapse. lately, there's been a new issue raised called equity or social justice. So they argue we have to do all these things for equity and social justice. I want to show you just how committed they are to equity and social justice. The Twin Cities MPO, known as the Metropolitan Council, recently announced that they are adopting a regional transit equity plan. They talked about, the press release talked at length about how poor people needed access to jobs, and it was really important for them to be able to reach those jobs, and so they needed transit equity. The transit equity program at the very end had 2 bullet points. Number 1, they were going to build 75 bus shelters in the poor neighborhoods of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Number 2, they were going to build a $1.5 billion light rail line to the wealthiest suburb of St. Paul, of Minneapolis, Eden Prairie. The cost of that line, $1.7 billion, that's $75 million a year annualized, plus $48 million a year to operate, 400 daily new trips. Cost per new rider, per new commuter, again, $48,000, the same as the Pinellas plan. So, in other words, transit equity consists of bus shelters for the poor and Tesla-priced transit for the rich. I want to remind you again that this presentation and all kinds of data, including data showing what percentage of people who don't have cars nevertheless drive to work in every urban area in America and in every state, is online at AmericanDreamCoalition.org 214 PAD. It's got to be caps. The PAD has to be capitalized. So, would you like to go next?
Okay.